and welcome back to our weekly Bible reading video. We've been reading Deuteronomy 19 through 22 this week, and like much of the Old Testament legal writings, we might find the practices and prescriptions for the Israelite people that are found in the law to be difficult to deal with. But even with difficult and sometimes offensive content, I like to look for the elements of grace shining through, and that's what I invite you to do with me this week. Let's find the grace in these passages from Deuteronomy. You know, the difficulties that we have with these very culturally conditioned practices should not surprise us. After all, the world of this time period was defined by an overall culture that was deeply isolated from God. And so God is working within this culture to bring the people of these societies, especially the society of Israel, back to Him, with that end goal of having all nations being brought back to Him through the Messiah who will arise out of Israel in the centuries to come. God is working to bring grace into a corrupt world. And so we see several instances of grace shining through some very difficult cultural practices. And remember that even today, God is working to bring grace into a corrupt world. And so maybe this will train us to see those instances of grace shining through in our own culture. Well, for instance, any of the Israelites' legal writings that provide protection for the poor or for the oppressed or for the overlooked, that's an act of grace. Specifically, we see in these passages several instances of women being given legal protection and legal recourse against the more powerful. That is an act of God's grace. For instance, the provisions for female captives that we find in chapter 21, or the provisions in chapter 22 for a wife whose husband wishes to just discard her. They may seem terribly backward and maybe even offensive for our modern sensibilities. But the overall point of grace being made here is that women are not property who can be dealt with in any way a man chooses. And that is revolutionary for this time period. That they have rights and that they are seen by God, that goes against the cultural norms. And again, this is an act of grace. Also providing for the environment in the context of war, in which the people were told not to destroy the fruit-bearing trees to make implements of war out of. That is an act of grace for our world. Also providing for the survival of mother birds when hunters take their young, ensuring that there will still be surviving birds to continue their fruitful multiplication. That is an environmental act of grace. We are seeing God's grace work throughout all of these chapters of Deuteronomy. The options that we see that are given in chapter 20, which allow for people to avoid warfare, that's another act of grace. It reminds us that God's overarching desire for us is for a peaceful life of fruitful living, of marrying, building homes, planting vineyards, providing for the faint of heart, allowing for the making of terms of peace with an enemy before war breaks out. That's an act of grace as well. All of these options are designed by God to provide a way out of war in a world that thirsts for violence and bloodshed. These gracious options all reveal the character of a loving and peaceful God, a God who cares for His creation. And so the first theme of these chapters is that grace is working even among the difficult environment in which the Israelites live. The second theme that emerges in these chapters is the importance of the order God has established in creation and the way that the Ten Commandments, specifically the latter six commandments, which deal with human-to-human interactions, the way that they preserve that order of God. In Genesis chapter 1, there is an emphasis on kind, everything being made according to its kind, which establishes boundaries that honor and secure the order that God created the cosmos with. This order enables the creation to thrive and to fulfill God's commandment to be fruitful. And so the regulations against wearing clothing that is made from mixed threads, or planting fields with mixed seeds, or yoking animals of different kinds, or what we would call species, these might sound very odd to us, but they're all designed to preserve the order of God's cosmos and to guarantee the flourishing of God's creation. Now, this brings up some interesting questions for us today. Like, is it wrong for us to wear cotton poly blends, or is it wrong for us to eat multi-grain bread? No, of course not. I mean, after all, we have to remember that these laws are part of the lifestyle, or the kosher laws that have been lifted for us, and which were specifically for the nation of Israel as they lived among pagan cultures. But it should inform certain ethical dilemmas that we face in the 21st century, things that have to do with the boundaries concerning kind and concerning order in God's creation. Things like certain bioethical concerns regarding hybrid animals or genetically engineered crops, or the introduction of AI into human spheres. I mean, these are certain situations where transgressing the boundaries that God gave us naturally might provide dangerous consequences for the thriving of humankind in the world. And so, this is why we need the Ten Commandments, that moral foundation of the law, to reflect the order of God that is found in creation. And so, we see these different realities reflected throughout these chapters of Deuteronomy. For instance, in reflecting the order of the fifth commandment, we are told that we must honor father and mother, and that there are real consequences to not doing so. In reflecting the order of the sixth commandment, we read many passages in these chapters concerning the sanctity of life and the handling of what is called blood guilt, both the inadvertent instances which do not transgress the sixth commandment and where the killer is spared, and those instances where the murder was purposeful and the killer is held responsible. Also, these chapters address the sacred nature of marriage and is advising us not to enter into that covenant lightly. And this preserves the order of the seventh commandment. These passages also deal with not lying, especially in legal matters, and that's in order to protect the innocent and to preserve the social order supplied by the ninth commandment. And finally, respecting the property of a neighbor, another theme of these sections of Deuteronomy, safeguards against the temptation to covet and to steal. And so we are found to be preserving the eighth and the 10th commandments. What we're learning from these chapters of Deuteronomy is that the order of God, which allows us to flourish and to be fruitful, must be reflected in our day-to-day lives. And as such, the Ten Commandments have practical application to our most mundane actions. If some of these culturally conditioned writings in Deuteronomy seem a little harsh to you, then take heart in the Christian teaching of progressive revelation. This teaches us that God was having to work within ungodly cultures to progressively reveal himself and his ways to the people, until the world was ready for the full revelation of God that was given in Jesus Christ. According to this teaching, we must view everything in the Old Testament as pointing forward to Jesus, and everything that comes after the New Testament as pointing back toward Jesus. And so everything must be viewed through the lens of Jesus Christ and his teachings and his life, his death, and his resurrection. Now, what this means for the Old Testament is that in Jesus, there is always an expansion of grace when compared to the law. There are three specific examples of this from our readings this week, and I want to go through them real quickly. First of all, we're given the law of proportionate revenge in the teaching to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. But we also know, as post-New Testament disciples, that Jesus challenged this law in Matthew chapter 5, teaching us instead to not seek revenge whatsoever. Remember, too, that this is in the same context as Jesus teaching a more stringent observance of the moral law reflected in the Ten Commandments. In the rest of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is calling on his followers to eliminate the internal roots of sin, those attitudes that cause sin to fester within us. So it's not that Jesus is asking us to loosen the law's demands, only that we become more outwardly gracious as we also become more inwardly holy. Well, secondly, it is difficult to read Deuteronomy's provisions concerning helping your neighbor's livestock when you find them in trouble, and to not think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. It helps us to understand that the scribes and the Pharisees, who were trying to follow every written letter of the law, they were ignoring the broader spirit of the law in their lack of compassion for one another. If God is concerned with the livestock of your neighbor, as is reflected in the law, isn't God more concerned with your neighbor himself or herself? Of course, Jesus also broadens the definition of neighbor in the parable, which again expands the purposes of God found in grace. And thirdly, it's very difficult to read the laws concerning adultery at the end of our readings this week without thinking about Jesus' interaction with the adulterous woman and her accusers, as recorded in John chapter 8. Of course, in that story, we don't get a glimpse of the man accused of adultery, only the woman, which is a violation of the laws of Deuteronomy. But the bigger lesson is that Jesus does not encourage the fulfillment of Deuteronomy's death sentence for the woman. Instead, he offers her both forgiveness and freedom from her sin. So, why does Jesus challenge these readings of Deuteronomy in his life and his ministry? It's because he takes our sin upon himself and our curse upon himself, which expands grace and the ability for us to be renewed and restored to God. The way Jesus deals with these sections of the law demonstrates again what we talked about at the beginning of our video. These are acts of grace, and his taking our curse upon himself is the ultimate act of grace. Notice what we read in this week's readings in Deuteronomy 21:23. We read this: anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. Jesus, by giving his life for us and taking the curse of our sin upon himself on the cross, opened the wider channels of grace for each one of us. And in doing that, he doesn't reverse the law of Deuteronomy, but he fulfills it. And he even takes its curse upon himself so that we might be freed from sin and so that we might be empowered to live a fruitful, flourishing life of communion with God. And when understood in these ways, I see the book of Deuteronomy a little differently, and I hope that you can too. So keep reading this week, and we'll come back together again next week as we continue to explore the writings of Deuteronomy. I'll see you soon.